Hello, and thanks for listening to your SCAMLE's exclusive podcast, ExplorED. On these episodes, you will enjoy exclusive interviews with some names you recognize and some people you'll be meeting for the first time. In each of our episodes, we will ask you to think and grow and reflect as a professional educator. If you aren't yet a member of SCAMLE, we encourage you to join today. More information can be found at www.scamle.org. There, find out more information about membership, conferences, and professional development opportunities. And don't forget to join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. My name is Sarah Evanson Atkinson, and I serve as the Professional Development Director for your SCAMLE. I am an educator of 21 years and a past SCAMLE president as well.
On this episode of ExplorED, I have the opportunity to sit down with Mona Alafi of Renewed Harmony for an amazing conversation about what we can do well and right for the young people in our classrooms in regards to equity, awareness, and advocacy, and where we might be able to improve as individuals and as a collective. I am most intrigued by the notion that we must move away from narratives that describe what we are not, rather than what we are. It's more important than ever to have a clear personal and professional view of who and what we are as people. It isn't sufficient to know solidly that we are not a racist, for example, but remain unsure of what we do stand for and who we are. Our conversation took an interesting turn, so I poured another cup of coffee and decided to offer you a part 2 to our time with Mona Alafi. The first half of our conversation takes place in this episode of ExplorED. The second installment, concerned with classroom management, is waiting for you in part 2 of this conversation in episode 8 of the ExplorED podcast. Be sure to stay with us as we explore these topics that are simultaneously invigorating and terrifying to talk about and consider. We are lucky enough to have with us today Miss Mona, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. But Mona, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Sarah. I'm excited to be here.
All right. So question for you, just to introduce yourself to our listeners. Who are you and what do you do? And what are you into right now? What are your passions?
Okay, well, my name is Mona Alafi, and I'm the founder and school equity strategist of Renewed Harmony. That's an organization designed to support school leaders and teachers with bringing more equitable practices into the schools. And the approach that we take is to empower all stakeholders to think of themselves as leaders and leaders of those equitable shifts. A lifelong passion. I'm the child of immigrants. My parents came here from Egypt. I think this is their 50th year this year, actually. As a child of Arab Americans, Egyptian Americans, Muslim Americans, I've known some of the challenges of exclusion and segregation in my own educational experience. And having seen that from my own experience as a student and as a teacher, I taught for 16 years high school English. I also taught a little bit of middle school, a little bit of elementary school in the beginning, but most of my time was in a high school English classroom. And I also served as a behavioral interventionist. And in that time, I really just became aware of inequities in our schools with grading, with discipline, with different outcomes. And I think because it's personal for me, and I found a space outside of school to navigate these issues, it became even more personal when I got to see how they impact the students that I taught and love. So that's me in a nutshell.
So let's get right into the good stuff that people want to hear. And I always enjoy sitting and talking with you because I always walk away learning something new. And I love that feeling, to be able to walk away feeling better and enriched and empowered from sitting with someone and having a conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Sarah. I feel the same way about you. And I also always walk away happier because you always make me laugh in all the best ways. You always know how to infuse humor in what you do. So
I try, because if we don't laugh, the alternative isn't really highly desirable. So, all right. So the agenda certainly is full. You made a list of all of your passion projects, and the agenda feels full as we work to navigate another school year deeply affected by this global pandemic.
But a lot of people argue that we cannot grow weary of addressing difficult topics with our students so that they can be adequately equipped to face the world that exists outside of our school building. So what are your thoughts on that? Is this the right time to collaborate and lift our voices in conversation, or do you think we should wait for this new normal to emerge organically? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think from the teachers that I serve and those that are personal friends, I think teachers are tapped right now. There's 3 different lenses you can look at supporting some kind of transformation or change. And these are like that individual resilience piece, that the systemic piece, and then the organizational piece. And so we have to look at each of those and how they interact. So a lot of what we're doing is trying to support people on an individual self-care level when there are systems and structures within the organization and within the institutions at large, the system at large, that are not creating the conditions for great self-care. And so we have to be willing to have conversations at a micro level and a macro level. So I think we have seen so many challenges in 2020 and 2021 with a global pandemic, with all kinds of racial tensions and an uprising of people standing up for their rights to be seen, with the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen all kinds of TikTok challenges that are really harming relationships at schools, and kids just not having the social emotional, stamina to be able to re-engage as they've come back into school in ways that aren't healthy and that aren't like influenced by social media, because so much of what we're going through as a society, the division and this polarization has been fueled by social media on so many different levels.
Absolutely.
And the media. So I think we have to look at how do we emotionally respond to that. And one of the challenges, I think, with how we, as teachers, we just want to read a book and fix it. We see there's all these challenges. We're like, let's get into conversation, let's do a book study, and then let's teach everybody about it, and it'll be all gone. And I think because we're so empowered to address the ailments of society through education, and that's what we do, that's who we are. And yet I think, like I said earlier, we have a macro and we have a micro way of approaching our own learning. So if we look at how are we doing professional development around the areas of tensions in our world, and how to respond to somebody getting murdered on George Floyd getting murdered on social media. We all saw it happen, and we all watched the protest. And then what do we do? And do we have an opportunity? So I think there's 4 different categories of professional development. There's number 1 is informational, where we get knowledge and skills. Mm-hmm. The second one is instrumental. This is giving us the time and the resources. So like maybe I'll get professional development on a new textbook, and do I have the time for that? Am I doing that in PLCs? How am I doing that? That's instrumental. The third one is motivational. And a lot of times, we are trying to find ways to inspire people. So you'll see at a lot of conferences when they do PD and they bring in speakers, they bring in inspirational speakers, because that's the motivational side of PD. And that's extrinsic versus intrinsic. But within the schools, a lot of times the motivational side of professional development comes from our appraisal, from our evaluation, from feeling valued by an external source. And I want to talk more about motivational, because when we are looking at how adults are motivated in professional development to grow as learners, their style is different than students. We look at pedagogy for students, but it's androgyny for adults. And when adult learners already have extrinsic motivation, we have intrinsic motivation, we don't have to try to motivate them. We are really looking at the science of adult learning. And also, they're completely motivated. We as adult learners and educators, we're motivated by experiential learning. So being able to apply what we learn to our classroom. So that's why when we do these book studies, a lot of times we get new awareness, but we're not sure how to apply it because it doesn't tell us how to apply it, or it tells us how to apply it in antagonistic ways. It tells us to be anti this And I want to talk about that. This is the fourth level of PD, which is social emotional. And I'm talking about adult social emotional, which underneath that is the cultural competency piece, the emotional intelligence piece. It's really looking at what people would call soft skills back in the day, those essential skills of adult social emotional learning. And I think that's where the gap is in so much of the learning. Because if I were to take those four categories, informational, instrumental, I could put those together as the logistical side of PD. And that's where we'd like to spend a lot of our energy. Oh, what? We have a disparity? Let's go ahead and teach teachers new skills. Let's teach them about reading intervention. The other two, motivational and social emotional, those are relational. Those all have to do with how I relate to my own efficacy, my own esteem, my own value, and how I relate to other people. So it's intra and interpersonal. And if we can get all four of those balanced in a way where we're looking at where are the gaps in learning, what is the source of where adults need to grow in order to grow students, we're going to have a transformational experience. Unfortunately, I think because logistical is what we can put our finger on, we tend to have PDs that are so focused on the logistical technical side of our craft, when really, when I look at why is it that we have inequitable grading practices? Why is it that we have disparities in discipline? Why is it that we see teachers creating, like, why is it that we have situations where there's tensions between teachers and parents? So much of that has to do with relational skills. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think real true transformation exists. And that's where I'm seeing it in my own work and the schools I support around our state. It's looking at and unpacking the relational skills.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about how often over the past 18 months, we've thrown around the phrase of, well, let's demonstrate grace. Let's show them grace. Let's give them grace. But I'm not certain that everybody has a similar shared idea of what exactly that looks like. And that's been a huge challenge for many teachers, because they feel as though the line between showing grace and being a pushover, or the line between showing grace and towing the line and being sure quality control is maintained, is just very fuzzy to them. And I think you bring up a really good point, is that that we have to share common definitions of things. Yes, whether it's the complicated topics or it's the less complicated topics, just how to be with each other.
Yes, and I think what your example right there with giving more grace and people trying to find the fine line, what I'm seeing is this is the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset in practice. And so much of where the fixed mindset comes from is our own stuff, our own trauma, our own exposure in our own lives. And I think that's been one of my biggest areas of research, focus, and growth in the way that I've delivered the learning. See, I used to do it where I would see disparate discipline data or disparate academic data. And I would try to start with cultural competence and begin with implicit bias training. And until I saw that not only was it not leading to gains in student outcomes, but it also was not really leading to transformation within any individuals. In fact, research shows us that implicit bias training often leads to more disparate outcomes. So while we read things that we read, okay, so we think.
So wait, hold on a second. That's very interesting. Okay, so because implicit bias training is something that a lot of folks really, I mean, like a lot.
I know
really advocate for. I mean, we hosted a conference several years ago where I swear half the options for attendees were, that's what it was. Where do we go wrong with that? So why do you think? Do you have any ideas about why that doesn't work? Because I do. I mean, awareness would lead to a change of behavior. I think that was the intent behind it.
It is the intent. It is. The challenge so often is that we grow in our consciousness without putting craftsmanship right there with it. So I have to grow in awareness, and then I have to be given the tools to unlearn how I normally did it with new skills to do it a different ways. It's not enough to just become aware that Black girls experience disparate discipline more than any other demographic there is in the United States.
Right.
That's not enough to know that. It's not enough to learn the term adultification bias and say, oh my gosh, I see these numbers. Bless their hearts, I feel so bad for them and all the people who are biased, because I'm not, and then if I do even say that I am biased, if I can't admit it, I've got to be given tools to do things a different way. And that does not just happen with implicit bias training. If the implicit bias is only focusing on race or gender or sexual orientation, or wherever we're seeing when we disaggregate the data and we see the disproportionate outcomes, we can't just look at it through that layer of identity without also looking at it through a trauma-informed lens. And when I talk about trauma-informed lens, I'm talking about the adult trauma, Sarah.
Right.
I'm talking about all the best practices that we know to do in schools for kids. We should also be doing with the adults in the adult learning side of things. So I need to be skilled as a trainer in the long-term impacts of trauma on adults, so I can be trauma skilled, trauma informed in my own practices. Because all or nothing thinking is evidence of trauma. And so when you said teachers have difficulty seeing the gray in those situations, they want to hold kids accountable. They want to be consistent.
Right.
But a trauma brain, somebody who still hasn't been able to really heal from their own wounds, is going to see the words consistency and accountability through an all or nothing lens. 100%. We got to do it all exactly the same. And so that's the limitation. But we look at it through a lens of implicit bias that's about race. And we think you have to be anti-racist. And the term anti-racist alone triggers people. The term, and there's evidence to show that being anti-anything doesn't get the same outcomes as what am I envisioning? What is the vision that I have, and how can I get to that goal? Instead, we're training people, because we're not doing it through a healthy social emotional lens. We're training people to be anti this and anti that, instead of for this and pro this and realize this and create. What do I want to create? And so because there's thought leaders who are teaching us that way, the work we're doing, if we're not equipped, if we haven't fully been trained, the work we're doing, it becomes antagonistic. And our own SEL limitations keep us in a state of being mad and angry, or depressed and despondent about the social conditions or the tensions between our different groups. And so we either want to fight, and you think about the language. I'm a freedom fighter. I'm anti-racist, or I'm anti this discrimination. And I'm not saying I'm for it, right? I'm a Muslim post 9/11 living in America in the South, in the Bible Belt.
Right.
That ain't easy.
Right. That's a thing. Yes, absolutely.
But the way to bring people to understand isn't through being an anti-Islamophobe. That to me is like, it's the double negative of that makes it so antagonistic. Learning doesn't happen in that space in creating conditions that are trauma informed.
Yeah.
That's going to spike people's amygdalas. That's going to keep people less vulnerable to learning.